She laughed when I proposed. Those 4 words still echo in my mind like a death knell. But now, 5 years later, as I sit in my corner office overlooking the city, watching her desperate messages flood my phone, I realize that laughter was the best thing that ever happened to me. The memory crystallizes with brutal clarity. March 15th, 2019. The restaurant I'd spent 3 months researching, the ring that cost me 4 months of overtime shifts, the speech I'd practiced in my bathroom mirror until the words felt like prayers. I can still feel the velvet box trembling in my sweaty palm, still see the way her face transformed from confusion to horror to pure, unfiltered amusement. Sarah had thrown her head back, auburn hair catching the candlelight, and released this sound. Not quite a giggle, not quite a cackle, but something that cut through me like broken glass. The other diners turned to stare. A waiter dropped a wine glass somewhere behind me. The whole world seemed to pause, waiting for her answer, and she gave it to them in the form of that hideous, soul-crushing laughter. I knelt there like an idiot, ring extended, my face burning with the kind of humiliation that brands itself onto your DNA. She covered her mouth with her manicured hand, trying to contain the mirth that kept bubbling up, her shoulders shaking with barely suppressed hysteria. Her words came out in breathless gasps between the laughter. She found it sweet, she said. Really sweet that I thought we were that serious. Did I actually believe she could see herself with someone like me? A warehouse worker who drove a 10-year-old Honda and split appetizers to save money? The ring was pretty, she admitted. Probably the nicest thing I'd ever owned. But surely I understood that she had different expectations for her life. The humiliation hit me in waves. First, the searing heat across my cheeks as every eye in the restaurant fixed on us. Then the cold emptiness in my stomach as her words registered. Finally, the trembling that started in my hands and spread through my entire body like some kind of emotional earthquake. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking out. The next clear memory I have is sitting in my car in the parking lot, staring at the ring in its stupid little box, my reflection warped in the restaurant window like a funhouse mirror of failure. The drive home passed in a blur of red lights and radio static. My apartment felt different when I walked in. Smaller, shabbier, like seeing it through her eyes had permanently altered its dimensions. The secondhand furniture I'd been proud of suddenly looked pathetic. The books I'd been reading to better myself seemed naive. Even my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked different. Weak, foolish, deserving of laughter. I called in sick to work the next day. Then the day after that. My supervisor, Mike, finally showed up at my door on the 3rd day, finding me in the same clothes I'd worn to the proposal, surrounded by empty takeout containers and crushed dreams. Mike was a good guy, 10 years older than me, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude toward life's bullshit. He took one look at me and made himself comfortable on my couch, waiting until I'd told him everything. His reaction wasn't what I expected. No sympathy, no anger on my behalf, just a slow nod and a question that changed everything. He asked if I was going to let some girl's opinion define who I was for the rest of my life, or if I was going to do something about it. That night, something shifted inside me. The humiliation was still there, would probably always be there, but it had transformed into something else. A cold, focused determination that felt almost foreign in my chest. I looked at myself in the mirror again, really looked, and for the first time in days, I saw potential instead of failure. I started making lists, skills I could learn, certifications I could earn, ways to transform myself from the man who got laughed at into someone who would never be laughed at again. The warehouse job that had felt like steady employment suddenly looked like a prison. My entire life looked like settling. The plan began to take shape over weeks of sleepless nights and obsessive research. I would go back to school. Not community college, not trade school, but real education. Computer science. The tech industry was exploding, and smart people were making obscene amounts of money writing code and building apps. I was good with numbers, had always been able to figure out complex systems. Why not systems that could make me rich? The student loan applications felt like signing away my soul, but I filled them out anyway. Every signature was a promise to the man I was going to become. I researched universities with the best placement rates, the most aggressive recruitment programs, the strongest connections to major tech companies. I wasn't just going to get a degree, I was going to transform myself completely. Sarah tried to contact me a few times in those early weeks. Casual texts about how she hoped I wasn't upset, how she valued our friendship, how she'd always care about me. Each message felt like salt in an open wound, but I saved them all. Something told me I might want to read them again someday. The acceptance letter from State University arrived on a Tuesday morning in June. The computer science program was competitive, demanding exactly what I needed. I gave my notice at the warehouse that afternoon, ignoring Mike's concerned expression and the comments from co-workers about making a huge mistake. My parents reacted predictably. Dad called it a midlife crisis at 26. Mom worried about the debt, about throwing away steady employment for what she saw as a pipe dream. Neither of them understood that steady employment was exactly what I was running from. Steady employment was what got you laughed at in restaurants. The first semester nearly broke me. Calculus at 8 in the morning, followed by programming fundamentals, data structures, discrete mathematics. My classmates were 18 years old with brains like supercomputers, while I sat in the back row struggling to keep up. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered that laughter, and somehow I found the strength to keep going. I lived like a monk. No social life, no dating, no expenses beyond absolute necessities. My apartment was a studio near campus, furnished with a desk, a bed, and a computer that I'd bought used from a graduate student. I survived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, spending every available dollar on textbooks and software licenses. The loneliness was crushing sometimes. Friday nights when my classmates went out to bars and parties, I sat alone in my room debugging code and watching tutorial videos. I'd see couples walking across campus, holding hands and laughing together, and the isolation would hit me like a physical blow. But I channeled all of that loneliness, all of that hunger for human connection, into my studies. By my second year, something clicked. The concepts that had seemed impossibly abstract began to make sense. I could see patterns in the code, elegant solutions to complex problems. My grades improved from barely passing to Dean's List. Professors started remembering my name, suggesting research opportunities, mentioning job prospects at major companies. The transformation wasn't just intellectual. Hours spent hunched over a computer had given me terrible posture, so I started going to the gym. Not for vanity, but because I realized that confidence comes from competence, and competence extends to every aspect of yourself. I learned to lift weights with the same methodical precision I applied to coding. I read books on nutrition, on personal development, on how successful people think and act and present themselves to the world. By junior year, I was unrecognizable. Not just physically, though. I'd gained 30 pounds of muscle and learned how to dress like someone with a future. The change was deeper than that. I carried myself differently. I spoke with authority about complex technical subjects. When I walked into a room, people noticed. The internship offers started coming in during my senior year. Google, Microsoft, Apple, companies I'd only dreamed of working for, were suddenly interested in me. The interviews were intense, but I was ready. Every algorithm question, every system design challenge, every behavioral interview felt like validation of the path I'd chosen. I accepted an offer from a startup in Seattle. The salary was more money than I'd ever imagined making. More than my father made after 20 years at the plant. More than Sarah had probably ever seen in her life. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't doing this for financial security. I was doing this to become the kind of person who could never be dismissed, never be laughed at, never be seen as inadequate. The startup environment was perfect for someone with my hunger. 18-hour days were standard. We were building something revolutionary, a platform that would change how people interacted with financial services. I threw myself into the work with religious intensity, becoming indispensable to every major project, every critical decision. 2 years in, we got acquired. The big tech company that bought us offered me a senior position with equity that would vest over 4 years. The signing bonus alone was more than I'd made in my entire life before college. But more importantly, I was becoming someone who mattered, someone whose opinions carried weight, someone who shaped the future instead of just reacting to it. I moved to San Francisco, rented a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. The view was stunning, but what I loved most was the feeling of looking down at the city, of being above it all in every sense that mattered. I bought expensive clothes not to show off, but because quality makes a statement about who you are and what you expect from life. The dating scene in tech was interesting. Smart women, accomplished women, women who appreciated intelligence and ambition. I had relationships, some serious enough that I considered where they might lead, but I never felt that desperate need for validation that had driven me to propose to Sarah. I was complete on my own now. Relationships were choices, not necessities. My parents visited once, flying out to see their transformed son in his transformed life. Dad walked around the apartment in stunned silence, picking up gadgets he didn't understand, staring out at views he'd never imagined. Mom kept asking if I was happy, if all this success was worth the years of struggle and isolation. I told her it was, and meant it. 3 years into the San Francisco job, I got headhunted by a venture capital firm. They wanted someone with technical expertise who could evaluate startup investments, someone who understood both the technology and the business potential. The salary they offered made my tech job look like minimum wage. More importantly, it was a chance to shape the entire industry, to decide which companies would succeed and which would fail. I accepted immediately. The VC world was different from tech. More political, more about relationships and intuition than pure technical skill. But I adapted quickly, using the same methodical approach that had carried me through every other transformation. I studied successful investors, learned their strategies, understood how they thought about risk and reward. My first major investment was a company building AI-powered financial analytics. The founders were brilliant kids from MIT, exactly the kind of people I'd once been intimidated by. Now I was the one asking the hard questions, the one they needed to impress. The company went public 2 years later, returning 50 times our initial investment. My reputation in the industry was established overnight. Success built on success. I became known as someone with an unusual ability to spot winning technologies early, to understand not just what was possible, but what people would actually want. My name started appearing in industry publications, my opinions sought by journalists and entrepreneurs. I was invited to conferences, asked to give keynote speeches, consulted by major corporations on their innovation strategies. 5 years after graduation, I was worth more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. But the real transformation was deeper than wealth. I'd become someone who commanded respect, someone whose judgment mattered, someone who shaped the future of technology and business. The scared warehouse worker who'd been laughed at in a restaurant was completely gone, replaced by someone powerful and confident and utterly self-possessed. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, Sarah sent me a friend request on LinkedIn. The notification appeared on my phone as I sat in a board meeting, discussing a $100 million investment in a quantum computing startup. For a moment, the entire room seemed to fade away. Sarah Mitchell, she'd kept her maiden name I noticed, was requesting to connect with me on a professional network. Her profile picture showed the same auburn hair, the same smile, though there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. I excused myself from the meeting and walked to my office, closing the door and staring at the notification. My assistant knocked once to ask if I was all right. Apparently, I looked pale. I told her to hold my calls and spent the next hour diving deep into Sarah's digital footprint. The story her social media told was one of slow decline disguised as normal life. She'd married someone named Derek 2 years after our disaster of a proposal. The wedding photos showed a modest ceremony, not the lavish affair I remembered her describing in her dreams. Derek worked in sales for a medical device company, made decent money but nothing spectacular. Their marriage had lasted 2 years. The divorce was finalized 8 months ago. According to court records I accessed through databases available to investors conducting due diligence, she'd gotten half of very little, a small settlement from the sale of their house. Enough to start over, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd once envisioned for herself. Her current job was as a marketing coordinator for a regional consulting firm. Not unsuccessful, but certainly not the executive career she'd once imagined. Her apartment, visible in the background of several photos, was nice but ordinary. She drove a 3-year-old sedan. Her vacation pictures showed weekend trips to nearby cities, not the European adventures she used to post about. Most telling were the photos from the past year. She looked tired in a way that went beyond simple fatigue. There was a defeated quality to her smile, a resignation that spoke of dreams quietly abandoned. She was still attractive, still carried herself well, but the confidence that had once seemed unshakable was gone. I accepted her connection request and waited. The message came 3 hours later. It started casual, friendly, mentioning that she'd seen an article about me in Fortune magazine and wanted to congratulate me on my success. She was proud of me, she said. Knew I'd always been special, even if she hadn't recognized it at the time. She hoped we could catch up sometime, maybe grab coffee if I was ever back in town. I read it 17 times, analyzing every word choice, every implication. This wasn't just social media reconnection. This was reconnaissance, testing the waters, seeing if the door was open. She'd done her research, knew exactly how successful I'd become, and was wondering if there might be an opportunity to revisit our history. I waited 2 days before responding. My message was polite but distant, Congratulations on her recent career moves, hopes that she was doing well. A vague suggestion that I might have time to catch up next time I visited my parents. Nothing that could be construed as encouraging, but nothing that slammed the door either. Her response came within an hour. She was so glad to hear from me, she said. She'd actually been thinking about me a lot lately, wondering how I was doing, remembering the good times we'd shared. She'd made some mistakes in the past, she admitted, and had learned so much about what really mattered in life. Maybe we could talk soon, really talk, about everything that had happened between us. The hook was set. She was interested, clearly interested in rekindling something between us. The question was what I wanted to do about it. I spent the next week researching her life in exhaustive detail. Social media, public records, mutual acquaintances. I built a complete picture of her trajectory since our breakup. The woman who had laughed at my proposal had made a series of increasingly desperate attempts to find security and status, each one failing to deliver the life she'd envisioned for herself. Her marriage to Derek had been a rebound, a quick grab for stability that had dissolved when she realized he lacked the ambition to give her the lifestyle she craved. The divorce had been messy, according to court documents. She'd fought for a larger settlement, claiming she'd sacrificed her career to support his goals. The judge hadn't been sympathetic. Her current dating life, visible through tagged photos and comments on friends' posts, was a string of disappointing encounters with men who were either too broke to impress her or too smart to take her seriously. She was 31 years old, watching her options narrow with each passing year, finally understanding that the fairy tale ending she'd always expected might never come. And then she'd seen my name in a magazine, learned that the man she'd dismissed as inadequate had become everything she'd always wanted in a partner. Successful, wealthy, powerful, respected. The kind of man who could give her the life she'd always believed she deserved. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could apologize for her past behavior, explain that she'd been young and foolish, convince me that she'd grown and changed and learned to value the things that really mattered. Maybe the man who'd once loved her enough to propose would be willing to give her another chance. The thought made me smile. Not a pleasant smile, but something cold and calculating that I barely recognized as my own expression. I decided to take a trip home for Thanksgiving. The message I sent her was perfectly crafted. I mentioned that I'd be visiting my parents for the holiday, asked if she'd like to have dinner and catch up properly. Nothing romantic, just two old friends reconnecting. I suggested a restaurant. Not the place where I'd proposed, but somewhere nice, somewhere that would showcase how much my circumstances had changed. Her response was enthusiastic. She'd love to see me, she said. She had so much to tell me, so much she wanted to explain. She'd made reservations at the place I'd suggested. Apparently, she'd called within minutes of receiving my message, not wanting to risk the chance that it might be booked. I flew home the day before Thanksgiving, staying at a boutique hotel downtown instead of my old apartment or my parents' house. I wanted complete control over the environment, over every detail of how this encounter would unfold. The afternoon of our dinner, I got my hair cut, selected my clothes with military precision, a custom suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Italian leather shoes, a watch that could have paid for a decent car. Not ostentatious, but unmistakably expensive. The kind of subtle wealth display that speaks to those who know how to read the signs. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, requesting a table with good lighting where I could see her entrance. The maitre d' recognized quality when he saw it, treating me with the deference that money and presence command. I ordered a glass of wine, something expensive that I knew Sarah wouldn't recognize but would understand was significant, and waited. She walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, and I had to admit she'd prepared carefully for this moment. Her dress was elegant, tasteful, chosen to remind me of the woman I'd once been infatuated with, while suggesting a maturity that hadn't been there before. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She'd clearly spent hours getting ready, hours thinking about how to present herself to maximum advantage. But I could see the signs of stress she couldn't completely hide. The slight tension around her eyes, the way she clutched her purse a little too tightly, the almost imperceptible pause before her smile reached full brightness. She was nervous, desperate even, in a way that the old Sarah never would have been. She spotted me immediately, and her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. A moment of genuine shock as she processed how much I'd changed, followed by something that looked almost like relief. Here was proof that her instincts had been right. I really had become the kind of man worth knowing. She approached the table with studied casualness, as if seeing a dramatically transformed ex-boyfriend was the most natural thing in the world. But I caught the way her eyes inventoried everything. The suit, the watch, the confidence with which I'd occupied the space. She was calculating, reassessing, understanding that the dynamic between us had shifted completely. I stood to greet her, noting how she had to look up at me now. The result of better posture and the confidence that comes with success. Her hug lasted a beat too long, and I caught the way she inhaled slightly, registering the expensive cologne I'd chosen specifically for its subtle power. The conversation started safely. We covered the basics of our respective lives, dancing around the real reasons we were both here. She told me about her job, her apartment, her recent vacation to Portland, all perfectly pleasant but unmistakably ordinary. I shared carefully selected highlights of my career, speaking modestly about achievements that I knew would impress her. She was good at hiding her reactions, but I'd spent years learning to read people in high-stakes negotiations. I could see the exact moment when the full scope of my success registered, when she understood that I wasn't just doing well, but was genuinely wealthy, genuinely powerful. Her posture shifted slightly, leaning forward, giving me her complete attention in a way that brought back memories of our early dating days. The wine helped, not enough to impair anyone's judgment, but enough to relax the careful boundaries we'd both erected. She became more animated, more like the woman I'd once known, laughing at my stories and sharing increasingly personal details about her life since our breakup. Her marriage came up naturally, and she was surprisingly honest about its failures. Derek had been a good man, she said, but they'd wanted different things. She'd realized that compatibility was about more than just attraction. Shared ambitions mattered, shared values, a vision for the future that both people could embrace. I asked what had changed for her, what she'd learned about what she really wanted in life. Her answer was clearly rehearsed but delivered with apparent sincerity. She'd grown up, she said, learned that financial security wasn't everything, that character mattered more than status, that she'd been shallow and materialistic in her youth. But even as she spoke these words, I could see her eyes cataloging the details of my obvious prosperity. The contradiction was almost amusing, claiming to have outgrown materialism while clearly being impressed by material success. As the evening progressed, she grew bolder in her revisionist history of our relationship. We'd been so young, she said, both of us figuring out who we were and what we wanted. She'd been scared of commitment, intimidated by the depth of feeling between us. She'd handled things badly, she admitted, and had regretted it ever since. The proposal came up eventually, as I'd known it would. She brought it up herself, actually, claiming she wanted to address the elephant in the room. She'd been in shock, she said, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it. She hadn't meant to hurt me, hadn't realized how her reaction would come across. She'd replayed that night 1,000 times, wishing she could have handled it differently. I listened to this performance with fascination. She was good. I had to give her credit for that. She managed to acknowledge what had happened while reframing it as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate humiliation. She was sorry if I'd been hurt, she said, but surely I could understand that she'd been young and confused and not ready for such a big step. The laughter, interestingly, was never directly mentioned. That was the part she couldn't rewrite, couldn't explain away. How do you apologize for finding someone's deepest emotional gesture hilarious? How do you walk back the kind of cruel amusement that cuts someone to their soul? She couldn't, so she pretended it had never happened. I played my part perfectly, gracious, understanding, mature enough to see past old wounds. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that I'd done my own growing up since then. We were different people now, I said, both of us presumably wiser and more self-aware. As the dinner wound down, the real purpose of the evening began to emerge. She was curious about my life, she said, about how I'd managed such an incredible transformation. She'd always known I was special, had always seen potential in me that maybe I hadn't seen in myself at the time. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I told her about the years after our breakup, but I edited the story carefully. Instead of the desperate humiliation that had driven me to change everything about myself, I painted a picture of natural evolution. I'd realized I wanted more from life, had decided to pursue education and career advancement. The success had followed naturally from hard work and smart decisions. She listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed her fascination with my transformation. How had I known which companies to invest in? What was it like working with such innovative people? Did I ever get tired of the fast-paced lifestyle? Her questions became increasingly personal. Was I seeing anyone seriously? Did I think about settling down, starting a family? What kind of life did I envision for myself in the next few years? I answered honestly. No serious relationships, no immediate plans for marriage or children, still focused on building my career and expanding my influence in the industry. But I left room for possibility, suggesting that the right person might change my priorities, that I wasn't opposed to commitment with someone who shared my values and ambitions. She absorbed this information with obvious interest, and I could practically see her positioning herself as that hypothetical right person. As we prepared to leave, she suggested we should do this again soon. She'd love to hear more about my work, she said, and maybe show me around some of the new developments in the city since I'd been gone. Perhaps next time I was in town, we could spend more time together, really catch up properly. I agreed that it would be nice to reconnect, that our conversation had reminded me how much I'd enjoyed her company. Nothing committal, but enough encouragement to keep her interested. Walking her to her car provided the perfect opportunity to display casual wealth. I'd rented a Tesla for my stay, not the most expensive car available, but unmistakably premium and tech-forward. She commented on it admiringly, and I offered to let her drive it sometime if she was interested. Her goodbye hug was definitely longer than friendship required, and she made a point of telling me how good it was to see me, how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished. She looked forward to our next conversation, she said, and hoped it wouldn't be another 5 years before we spoke again. I drove back to my hotel feeling satisfied with the evening's work. The hook was firmly set. Sarah was interested, intrigued, and beginning to see possibilities that hadn't existed 5 years ago. She was also vulnerable in ways she probably didn't fully recognize. Lonely, financially insecure, watching her options narrow as she approached her mid-30s. The next phase would require patience and careful planning. Over the following weeks, I maintained a regular contact. A text message here, an email there, nothing that suggested overwhelming interest but enough to keep me present in her thoughts. I shared articles about my industry that I thought might interest her, mentioned interesting restaurants I discovered in my travels, asked casual questions about her work and life. She responded enthusiastically to every contact, often sending much longer messages than what I'd written. She told me about her days, shared photos of her Thanksgiving dinner, asked detailed questions about my business travels. Her interest was obvious and growing. I began sharing more personal details, not vulnerable confessions, but carefully chosen insights into my life and thoughts that would make her feel special, trusted, like someone I was opening up to. I mentioned how lonely success could be sometimes, how hard it was to find people who understood the pressures and responsibilities that came with my position. She responded to these openings with increasing intimacy, sharing her own struggles with loneliness and disappointment. Her marriage had failed partly because Derek hadn't understood her ambitions, she said. He'd wanted her to be satisfied with a simple, ordinary life, but she'd always known she was meant for something more. This was the narrative she was constructing, that she was someone who'd always recognized quality and ambition, someone who'd been held back by partners who couldn't match her vision. It was a convenient rewrite of history that erased her earlier dismissal of my potential. I encouraged this self-perception, agreeing that ambitious people often struggle to find partners who could appreciate their drive. I shared stories about successful friends whose relationships had suffered because their partners couldn't adapt to wealth and prominence. The message was clear. Success required a certain kind of partner, someone sophisticated enough to handle the lifestyle. By December, she was texting me daily. Nothing dramatic or overwhelming, just consistent contact that suggested I'd become a regular part of her thoughts. She asked about my holiday plans, wondered if I'd be visiting home again soon, mentioned events and restaurants she thought I might enjoy if I did decide to visit. I told her I was planning to spend New Year's Eve in the city, staying at my usual hotel for a few days to visit family and old friends. Maybe we could celebrate together, I suggested casually. Nothing elaborate, just dinner and perhaps some champagne to ring in the new year. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. She'd love to spend New Year's Eve with me, she said. It would be so much more meaningful than the usual crowded parties and artificial celebration. She was looking forward to a quiet, elegant evening with someone who actually mattered to her. I made reservations at the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the kind of place that required connections and serious money. The type of establishment Sarah had probably never been to, but had always dreamed of experiencing. I reserved a private dining room, ensuring we'd have complete privacy for whatever conversation might develop. I also made other preparations. A suite at the city's most prestigious hotel, arrangements for flowers and champagne to be delivered to the room, a carefully planned evening that would demonstrate exactly how much my life had changed since she'd known me. The week before New Year's, her messages became almost feverish with anticipation. She'd bought a new dress, she told me, something special for our evening. She'd been looking forward to it for weeks, couldn't wait to hear about all my adventures and share what had been happening in her life. Reading between the lines, it was clear she saw this as more than just dinner between old friends. She was positioning it as a potential turning point, a chance to explore whether the connection we'd once shared might be rekindled under dramatically different circumstances. I arrived in town on December 30th, checking into my suite and confirming all the arrangements. The restaurant, the flowers, the champagne, everything was perfect. I even had a backup plan in case the evening went differently than expected, though I was fairly confident about how she would respond to what I had in mind. She texted me that morning, saying she could barely concentrate at work, so excited about our evening together. She'd taken the next day off, she mentioned, in case we ended up staying out late celebrating. The implication was unmistakable. She was prepared for this evening to extend into New Year's Day, prepared for the possibility that we might pick up where we'd left off 5 years ago under very different circumstances. I spent the afternoon of December 31st preparing with the same methodical care I'd applied to every major business negotiation. The right clothes, the right mindset, the right strategy for achieving my objectives. This wasn't about romance or rekindling old feelings. This was about closure, justice, and giving Sarah exactly what she deserved. At 7 o'clock, I arrived at her apartment to pick her up. She'd given me her address weeks earlier, and I'd driven by several times to familiarize myself with the neighborhood. It was nice enough, a decent area, reasonably safe, but clearly a step down from the suburban house she'd shared with Derek. She answered the door looking stunning. The dress she'd mentioned was perfect. Elegant, expensive looking, chosen to remind me of everything I'd once found attractive about her, while suggesting a sophistication that hadn't been there in our younger days. Her hair and makeup were flawless, her smile bright with excitement and anticipation. But I could see the nervousness underneath, the way she checked her appearance in the hallway mirror, the slight tremor in her voice as she complimented my appearance. She was taking a big risk tonight, gambling that the man who'd once loved her might be willing to overlook the past for a chance at a different future. The drive to the restaurant gave us time to talk privately, and she was more open than she'd ever been about her hopes for the evening. She kept touching my arm as she spoke, laughing at my comments with perhaps more enthusiasm than they deserved, making it clear that she found me attractive, interesting, worth pursuing. She asked about my plans for the new year, whether I'd be traveling much for work, if I ever got lonely living such a high-powered lifestyle. The subtext was obvious. She was positioning herself as someone who could provide companionship, understanding, partnership for whatever came next in my life. I responded encouragingly but carefully, letting her know that I valued her company while stopping short of making any commitments. The evening was still young, I said, and I was looking forward to seeing where our conversation led. The restaurant exceeded even my expectations. The private dining room was elegant and intimate, with soft lighting and a spectacular view of the city. Our table was set with crystal and china that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The wine I'd selected was older than either of us, chosen specifically for its significance and price point. Sarah's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She looked around the room with genuine awe, clearly impressed not just by the luxury, but by the casual way I navigated this level of sophistication. This was my world now. The message was clear, and I belonged here completely. The conversation flowed easily through the first courses. She asked intelligent questions about my work, showing genuine interest in the technical and business challenges I faced. She shared insights about her own career that demonstrated intelligence and ambition, making it clear that she wasn't just attracted to my success, but respected the work that had created it. As the evening progressed and the wine relaxed our boundaries, she became more personal in her reflections. She'd been thinking a lot about the path her life had taken, she said, about the choices she'd made and opportunities she might have missed. Meeting me again had reminded her of how much potential had existed between us, how different things might have been if she'd been mature enough to recognize it at the time. This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the moment when she would reveal how completely her perspective had changed. She told me about the years since our breakup, but her version was carefully edited to position her as someone who'd been searching for what we'd once had. Her marriage to Derek had been an attempt to find security, she said, But she'd quickly realized that security without genuine connection was empty. She'd learned that she needed someone who challenged her, someone whose success and ambition matched her own aspirations. Someone like me, was the unspoken conclusion. As we moved through the courses, she became increasingly bold in her revisionist history of our relationship. We'd been perfect together in so many ways, she said, just at the wrong time in our lives. She'd been too young to appreciate what I was offering, too scared of commitment to recognize a good thing when she had it. The proposal came up again, as I'd known it would. This time, her version was even more sanitized. She'd been overwhelmed, she said, caught completely off guard by the depth of emotion I'd shown. She hadn't been ready for that level of commitment, but that didn't mean she hadn't cared deeply about me. In fact, she'd probably been more affected by the intensity of the moment than I'd realized. I listened to this fantasy with fascination. She was rewriting history so completely that the cruel laughter was being transformed into emotional overwhelm. The humiliation I'd experienced was being recast as a misunderstanding between two people who'd cared too much to navigate the situation gracefully. It was masterful, really, the way she was constructing a narrative that acknowledged what had happened while absolving herself of responsibility for the pain it had caused. As we reached dessert, the conversation turned to the future. She was curious about my plans, she said, both professional and personal. Did I see myself staying in San Francisco permanently? Was I happy with the bachelor lifestyle? Or did I think about settling down eventually? Her questions became increasingly direct as the evening progressed. What kind of partner would I want in my life? What qualities would matter most to someone in my position? Did I think it was possible for people to change fundamentally, to grow beyond their younger mistakes? I answered thoughtfully, describing an ideal partner who would be intelligent, ambitious, sophisticated enough to handle the social demands of my lifestyle, someone who understood business and could engage with my colleagues and clients, someone who'd learned from past relationships and was ready for genuine partnership. She absorbed these criteria with obvious satisfaction, clearly believing she met every requirement I'd described. As midnight approached, she made her intentions explicit. She'd missed me, she said, more than she'd realized until seeing me again. These past few weeks of reconnecting had reminded her of how good we'd been together, how much potential had existed between us. She wondered if I felt the same way, if I thought there might be a chance for us to explore what could happen now that we were both more mature and self-aware. The moment had arrived. After months of careful planning, weeks of patient cultivation, hours of listening to her rewrite our history, I was finally in position to deliver the justice I'd been pursuing. I reached across the table and took her hand, looking directly into her eyes with what must have appeared to be deep emotion. I told her that seeing her again had affected me more than I'd expected, that I'd been thinking constantly about our past and what might be possible for our future. Her face lit up with hope and relief. This was what she'd been working toward, what she'd been hoping to hear all evening. I continued, telling her that she was right about us having been perfect together in many ways. We'd understood each other, shared similar dreams and ambitions, connected on a level that I hadn't found with anyone else since. She squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with anticipation. Then I told her about the business trip I was leaving for in the morning, how I'd be traveling for the next several weeks but would love to continue this conversation when I returned. Perhaps she could come visit me in San Francisco, see my life there, meet some of my friends and colleagues. She agreed immediately, enthusiastically. She'd love to visit, she said, would take time off work if necessary. She wanted to see my world, understand the life I'd built, explore what possibilities might exist for us. I suggested she could stay at my apartment, save money on hotels, and have more time for us to really talk. She accepted immediately, already planning what she'd pack, wondering how long she might stay. As midnight struck and we shared what she clearly thought was a rekindling kiss, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The trap was set, the bait taken, the prey convinced that she was the predator. In 3 weeks, Sarah would fly to San Francisco, expecting to begin a new chapter of her life, with a man who'd become everything she'd always wanted in a partner. She would arrive ready to charm my friends, impress my colleagues, and secure her position as the woman sophisticated enough to handle my success. What she would find instead was the real consequence of laughing at someone's heart. The flight to San Francisco was everything Sarah had dreamed it would be. First class, paid for by a man who could afford such gestures without thinking twice. She'd texted me photos from the airport lounge, from her seat on the plane, her excitement palpable even through digital communication. I wasn't there to meet her at the airport. A business emergency that had come up at the last minute, I'd explained. but my driver would take care of everything. The driver was real, and so was the luxury sedan that delivered her to my building in Pacific Heights. My apartment was designed to impress, and from her messages, it had achieved exactly that effect. Floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic views of the bay, museum-quality art, furniture that whispered rather than shouted wealth. She sent me a photo of herself on my balcony, the city spread out behind her, looking like she belonged in such rarefied surroundings. I arrived that evening with flowers and apologies, explaining that the crisis had been resolved, but welcoming her properly to my world. She'd clearly spent the afternoon exploring the apartment, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Everything was beautiful, she said, so sophisticated and perfectly chosen. She could see my personality in every detail, could imagine how much thought had gone into creating such a perfect environment. We had dinner at a restaurant in my neighborhood, the kind of place where the chef knew my preferences and the staff treated me like family. Sarah was charming and intelligent, asking good questions about the food and wine, demonstrating that she could hold her own in this elevated social environment. She fit in perfectly, which had always been part of her appeal. Sarah had never lacked sophistication or social intelligence. She'd simply been wrong about where my life was heading. The next few days followed a carefully orchestrated pattern. I introduced her to my world gradually, letting her meet some of my less important colleagues first, allowing her to get comfortable with the dynamics before bringing her into more significant social situations. She was brilliant at it, I had to admit, charming without being obsequious, interested without being intrusive, sophisticated without being pretentious. She asked intelligent questions about people's work, remembered names and details, made the kind of impression that reflected well on me. My colleagues liked her. Several mentioned to me privately that she seemed like a good match for my lifestyle, someone who could handle the social demands and travel schedule that came with my position. A few of the partners' wives made a point of including her in their conversations, treating her like someone who might become a permanent fixture in our social circle. Sarah absorbed all of this validation with obvious satisfaction. She was succeeding in the audition she didn't realize she was performing, proving to herself and everyone around her that she belonged in this world of success and influence. We attended a gallery opening on her fourth night in town, an exclusive event for an artist whose work was being collected by major tech executives. Sarah wore a dress she'd bought specifically for the trip, something elegant and expensive that suggested she was accustomed to such occasions. She was magnetic that night, drawing people into conversation, making connections, demonstrating the social intelligence that had always been one of her greatest assets. I watched her work the room with professional admiration, seeing how she identified the most important people and positioned herself to make favorable impressions. Several people asked about her that evening, who she was, how long we'd been together, whether she was planning to relocate to San Francisco. I kept my answers vague but encouraging, suggesting that we were exploring possibilities, that nothing was decided, but we were enjoying getting to know each other again. The speculation was exactly what I'd hoped for. Word was spreading through my social and professional networks that I was seeing someone serious, someone who might represent a significant change in my personal life. On her fifth day in town, I arranged for her to meet my most important colleague, the senior partner who'd been responsible for bringing me into the firm. David was in his 60s, married to the same woman for 30 years, with strong opinions about the kind of personal stability necessary for long-term success in our business. The lunch was at his private club, an institution that represented everything Sarah had always aspired to. Old money, established power, the kind of social environment where real influence was exercised quietly. She prepared for the meeting like a job interview, asking me detailed questions about David's background and interests, making sure she'd be able to engage him on subjects that mattered to him. She was perfect, poised, articulate, genuinely interested in his stories about the early days of venture capital. She asked thoughtful questions about industry history, demonstrated knowledge of current trends, showed exactly the kind of intellectual curiosity that successful people appreciate in their partners. David was impressed, I could tell. He made a point of mentioning her favorably to me afterward, suggesting that I seemed to have found someone who understood the demands of our profession. He hoped we'd bring her to the firm's annual retreat in Napa, he said. It would be good for the other partners to get to know her better. That evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and pink, Sarah talked about how much she'd enjoyed meeting David and the other people in my professional circle. Everyone had been so welcoming, she said, so gracious about including her in their conversations and social plans. She could see herself fitting into this world, she admitted. The pace, the sophistication, the sense of being at the center of important decisions, it all felt right to her in a way that her life back home never had. She'd always known she was meant for something more than the ordinary, middle-class existence she'd been settling for. This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the moment when she would fully commit to the fantasy I'd been constructing. I told her that I'd been thinking about her place in my life, about what it would mean to have a real partner who could share not just my home, but my professional world. The demands were significant, I said. Travel, social obligations, the pressure of always being evaluated by colleagues and clients. Not everyone could handle that kind of scrutiny. She assured me that she could handle anything, that she'd been preparing for this kind of life without realizing it. Her failed marriage had taught her what she really wanted, she said, and watching me navigate my world had shown her what true partnership could look like. I suggested she extend her visit, take some additional time off work to really explore whether this could work between us. She agreed immediately, so quickly that I wondered if she'd already been planning to ask for exactly that. Her call to her employer the next morning was a masterpiece of professional diplomacy. She explained that she was dealing with a personal situation that required additional time away from the office, assuring them that she remained committed to her position but needed flexibility to handle this important matter. She got the time off, though I could tell from her end of the conversation that her supervisor wasn't entirely pleased. Sarah didn't seem concerned about the potential career consequences. She was betting everything on a future that included me. We spent the next week deepening her integration into my life. She met more of my friends, attended more professional events, accompanied me to a board meeting where I was presenting an investment proposal. She handled every situation with grace and intelligence, proving over and over that she could function successfully in the elevated social environment I inhabited. I began including her in more personal aspects of my routine. We went shopping together, and I encouraged her to buy clothes appropriate for the lifestyle she was auditioning for. We looked at art galleries, and I let her help select a piece for my apartment. We discussed travel plans, restaurants she wanted to try, people she hoped to get to know better. She was building a life with me in her mind, creating a vision of our future that included marriage, social prominence, financial security, and the kind of status she'd always believed she deserved. 2 weeks into her extended stay, she brought up the subject of her apartment lease back home. It was coming up for renewal, she mentioned casually, and she was wondering whether it made sense to commit to another year. The implication was obvious. She was ready to relocate permanently if our relationship continued developing in the direction it seemed to be heading. I told her we should probably have a serious conversation about the future, about what we both wanted and whether our goals were compatible. She agreed eagerly, clearly believing this would be the discussion where we made our relationship official and began planning our life together. I suggested we have this conversation at home, over dinner, where we could speak privately about such important matters. She spent the afternoon preparing for what she obviously saw as a pivotal moment in her life, buying wine and flowers, cooking an elaborate meal designed to showcase her domestic capabilities along with her social skills. The table she set was perfect. Candles, my best china, an arrangement that turned dinner into a romantic occasion worthy of life-changing decisions. She'd clearly put enormous thought into every detail, creating an environment that would encourage the kind of intimate conversation she was hoping for. As we sat down to eat, she was radiant with anticipation. This was the moment she'd been working toward for months, the culmination of careful planning and strategic positioning. She was about to secure the life she'd always wanted with the man she'd once dismissed as inadequate. I began by telling her how much I'd enjoyed having her in my life these past few weeks, how impressed I'd been with her ability to integrate into my world. She was everything I could want in a partner, I said. Intelligent, sophisticated, socially adept, beautiful, ambitious. Her smile was luminous, her eyes bright with hope and satisfaction. I continued, explaining that a serious relationship at this stage of my life would represent a major commitment, something that would affect not just my personal happiness, but my professional relationships and social standing. The woman I chose to build a life with would need to be someone I could trust completely, someone whose judgment and character were beyond question. She nodded eagerly, clearly believing she met every criteria I was describing. Then I told her that before we could move forward, there was something from our past that we needed to address honestly. Something that had affected me more deeply than I'd ever admitted. Something that would need to be resolved before I could fully trust her with my heart again. Her expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with the anticipation. But she encouraged me to share whatever was troubling me. She wanted complete honesty between us, she said. Wanted to address any concerns so we could build something real and lasting together. I reached across the table and took her hand, exactly as I had on New Year's Eve, looking directly into her eyes with apparent vulnerability and pain. Then I asked her if she remembered the night I proposed to her 5 years ago. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her hand went cold in mine, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to handle this conversation she'd been hoping to avoid forever. She remembered, she said carefully, and she was still sorry about how she'd handled such an emotional moment. She'd been young and scared, not ready for such a big step, but she'd never meant to hurt me. I nodded understandingly, telling her that I'd always known her rejection wasn't meant to be cruel. Young people make mistakes, handle difficult situations poorly, react without thinking about the consequences. Relief flooded her expression. She began to relax, thinking we were going to have the conversation she'd been expecting, the one where past misunderstandings were forgiven and forgotten in favor of a more mature future. Then I asked her about the laughter. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat frozen, her hand still in mine, her eyes wide with the kind of panic that comes from being caught in a lie you've been telling so long you almost believed it yourself. I waited, giving her time to process the fact that I remembered everything, that her careful revision of history had failed completely. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She tried to deny it at first, claiming she hadn't laughed, that I must be misremembering the details of such an emotional night. I described the sound exactly. Not quite a giggle, not quite a cackle, but something that had cut through me like broken glass. I described how she'd thrown her head back, how her shoulders had shaken with barely suppressed mirth, how she'd covered her mouth with her hand trying to contain the amusement that kept bubbling up. I told her about the other diners turning to stare, about the waiter dropping a wine glass, about how the whole world had seemed to pause while she found my proposal hilariously inadequate. She began to cry then, not the elegant tears of romantic movies, but the ugly, desperate crying of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. She tried to explain, to contextualize, to minimize what had happened, but we both knew there was no explanation that could transform cruel laughter into anything resembling kindness. I let her cry for a while, observing her breakdown with the clinical detachment I'd learned in business negotiations. This was what defeat looked like when it was complete and undeniable. When her tears finally subsided, I continued with my story. I told her about the weeks that followed her rejection, about the humiliation that had consumed me, about how her laughter had branded itself onto my soul like a scar that would never fully heal. But I also told her about what that laughter had ultimately given me. The motivation to transform myself completely, to become someone who could never again be dismissed or diminished or found inadequate by anyone. I explained how her cruel amusement had been the catalyst for everything I'd achieved, how every success in my life could be traced back to that moment when she'd shown me exactly what she thought I was worth. She listened in growing horror as I described the years of work, the calculated self-improvement, the methodical construction of a life designed to prove her wrong. She began to understand that nothing about our recent reconnection had been accidental, that every moment of the past few months had been carefully orchestrated to bring us to this point. The business trip that had delayed my arrival at the airport hadn't been real. The colleagues who'd been so impressed with her had been chosen specifically for their influence and opinions. The social events, the restaurants, the careful introduction to my world, all of it had been designed to give her exactly what she'd always wanted, to let her taste the life she could have had if she'd been capable of recognizing potential instead of just existing success. I told her about the research I'd done into her life, about how I'd tracked her declining prospects and increasing desperation. I'd known about her failed marriage before she'd mentioned it, known about her financial struggles, her professional disappointments, her shrinking pool of romantic options. I'd understood exactly what my success would mean to her, how the man she'd dismissed as unworthy had become everything she'd ever wanted in a partner. I'd known she would reach out, would try to reconnect, would position herself for another chance with someone who could finally give her the life she felt she deserved, and I'd let her do it. I'd encouraged her fantasies, supported her delusions, allowed her to believe that redemption was possible, that the past could be rewritten, that love could conquer the kind of humiliation she'd inflicted. I'd given her 3 weeks in paradise, 3 weeks of living the life she'd always wanted, 3 weeks of believing she'd finally gotten everything right. And now I was taking it all away. She begged, of course. She pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, for another chance to prove that she'd changed. She admitted that she'd been horrible, shallow, cruel in her youth, but insisted that she was different now, that she'd learned from her mistakes, that she could be the partner I deserved. I listened to her desperate promises with the same detached interest I'd shown her tears. She was offering me everything. Her complete devotion, her willingness to relocate, to change careers, to reshape her entire life around my needs and preferences. It was pathetic, really, how completely her pride had crumbled in the face of losing what she'd thought was finally within her grasp. I told her that I believed she was sorry, that I could see she'd genuinely changed in many ways. She was more mature now, more self-aware, more capable of appreciating what she'd lost. But none of that mattered, I explained, because this had never been about getting back together. This had been about justice, about giving her a chance to experience the same devastating loss she'd inflicted on me. I wanted her to know exactly what it felt like to have someone laugh at your deepest hopes, to be dismissed as inadequate by someone whose opinion mattered to you, to have your worthiness judged and found amusing. The difference was that my rejection would be based on her actual character, rather than superficial judgments about status and financial potential. She wasn't being dismissed because she was poor or unsuccessful. She was being dismissed because she was the kind of person who could laugh at someone's vulnerable moment of love. I stood up from the table, looking down at her tear-stained face with the same cold assessment she'd once directed at my proposal. Then I told her exactly what I thought she was worth. Nothing. She was nothing to me, would always be nothing to me, regardless of how much she changed or how desperately she wanted redemption. Some actions are unforgivable, not because they cause permanent damage, but because they reveal permanent character flaws. Her laughter that night hadn't just hurt my feelings. It had shown me who she really was underneath all the charm and sophistication. Someone capable of finding genuine cruelty amusing. Someone who could take pleasure in another person's humiliation. Someone fundamentally lacking in empathy and kindness. Success and maturity might have changed her circumstances, but they hadn't changed her essence. She was still the same person who'd found my love hilarious. Still someone who measured people's worth by external achievements, rather than internal qualities. The only difference now was that the tables had turned. Now she was the one who wasn't good enough, not because of her bank account or job title, but because of her character. I told her that her flight back home was booked for the next morning, that my driver would take her to the airport, that she should pack her things and prepare to return to her ordinary life with her ordinary prospects and her extraordinary regrets. She tried one last time to change my mind, offering to do anything, be anything, accept any conditions if I would just give her a chance to prove herself worthy of the life she glimpsed. But that was exactly the problem, I explained. She still didn't understand that worthiness couldn't be earned or proven or negotiated. It was something you either possessed or you didn't, something that revealed itself in moments of crisis or opportunity. She'd revealed her true self 5 years ago when she'd laughed at my proposal. Everything since then had just been an extended performance, a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of her own cruelty. I left her sitting at the table I'd set for our romantic dinner, surrounded by the remnants of the life she'd thought she was about to claim. The candles were still burning, the wine still breathing, the flowers still beautiful in their arrangement. But the dream was over, had always been an illusion, had never been anything more than an elaborate revenge fantasy designed to give her exactly what she deserved. The next morning I was gone before she woke up, a business trip to New York that would keep me away for several days, giving her time to pack and leave without the awkwardness of another confrontation. I left her a note explaining that the apartment was hers until checkout time, that my driver would be available whenever she was ready to go to the airport, that her flight was confirmed and her seat upgraded to first class as a final gesture of courtesy. I also left her the piece of art we'd selected together, the one she'd helped choose for my apartment. A small consolation prize for the life she'd almost had, a beautiful reminder of the paradise she'd lost through her own actions. From my hotel in New York, I received a series of text messages charting her emotional journey from desperate hope to angry resignation. She tried one last time to convince me that I was making a mistake, that I was letting the past destroy something that could be beautiful in the present. Then she tried to hurt me, to make me feel guilty for the elaborate cruelty of what I'd done to her. She called me calculating, manipulative, emotionally stunted. She accused me of being incapable of real love, of using my success to punish people instead of building genuine connections. Finally, she tried to diminish what I'd achieved, suggesting that my success was hollow, that money and status couldn't compensate for the emptiness of a life built on revenge rather than love. I didn't respond to any of the messages. There was nothing left to say. No point in engaging with someone whose opinion had stopped mattering to me the moment she'd laughed at my proposal. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved across the country, taken a job in Portland, started dating someone new. The story she was telling people was that we'd reconnected briefly, but realized we wanted different things, that the relationship had ended amicably when we couldn't reconcile our different life goals. It was a face-saving narrative that protected her dignity while acknowledging the reality that whatever chance we'd had was gone forever. I respected her for that, actually. It showed more emotional intelligence than I'd expected her to demonstrate. A year after that, she was engaged to someone else. A decent guy from what I could tell. Someone stable and kind who would never give her the glamorous life she'd always wanted, but would also never humiliate her in a restaurant or make her feel inadequate for her dreams. I felt nothing when I heard the news. Not satisfaction, not regret, not curiosity about whether she'd learned anything from our encounter. She'd become what she'd always been to me after that night 5 years ago. Irrelevant. My life continued its upward trajectory. More successful investments, more recognition in the industry, more opportunities to shape the future of technology and business. I dated sophisticated women who appreciated intelligence and ambition, women who understood that success required sacrifice and dedication. I never fell in love again the way I'd loved Sarah. Never felt that desperate, vulnerable need for another person's validation and acceptance. Whether that was because I'd learned to value myself independently, or because her laughter had damaged something fundamental in my capacity for trust, I couldn't say. But I was content with the trade-off. Love had made me weak, had left me vulnerable to the kind of humiliation that could reshape a person's entire existence. Success had made me strong, had given me the power to control my own destiny and protect myself from anyone who might find my deepest feelings amusing. Sometimes, late at night in my penthouse apartment, I'd think about that moment in the restaurant when everything changed. Not the proposal itself, but the laughter that followed it, the sound that had branded itself onto my memory and motivated everything that came after. I'd wonder what would have happened if she'd said yes, if we'd gotten married and built a simple life together on love instead of ambition. Would I have been happy with ordinary success, content with modest achievements, satisfied with being just another face in the crowd? Probably. Love has a way of making you grateful for small things, of finding meaning in everyday moments instead of grand gestures. I might have been a different person, a softer person, someone who measured success by emotional connection rather than financial achievement. But that person had died in that restaurant 5 years ago, murdered by laughter that revealed the cruel indifference of someone I'd thought understood my heart. The man who'd replaced him was harder, smarter, more successful, and completely invulnerable to the kind of humiliation that had once destroyed him. I'd gotten my revenge, had given Sarah exactly what she deserved, had proven that the man she dismissed as inadequate could become everything she'd ever wanted and still find her unworthy of his attention. It was perfect justice, cold and calculated and completely satisfying. And if sometimes I felt empty in the aftermath, if sometimes I wondered whether revenge was a meal that left you hungry no matter how thoroughly you consumed it, well, that was a small price to pay for the knowledge that no one would ever laugh at my heart again. The man who'd knelt in that restaurant with a ring and a dream was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that power was the only protection against the casual cruelty of people who judge worth by appearances rather than essence. I'd become everything I'd needed to become to survive her laughter, and in the process, I discovered that survival was its own form of victory, even if it sometimes felt indistinguishable from a beautifully constructed form of death.